again, everyone. Tough act to follow from the results from Ruben, but I'll give it a go. Very different topic. So looking specifically at an area of the market that the ABL Group and specifically OWC, so the part of the group that I look after, is really a leader in, and that's floating offshore wind. So I'm the managing director of OWC and look after our global business focused on offshore wind and renewables consultancy. So OWC has been around for a long time, established in 2011, so slightly before the rest of the ABL Group. We got to have our 10-year party a little bit before the rest of the group. But we were founded by people who've been involved in wind farm construction since the 1990s, when really the industry began. We're a global specialist, but with a local presence. So we've got offices everywhere around the world where there's offshore wind activity happening, and we're starting to broaden that out to other renewables as well, although we're not going to try and be in every country where there's other renewables, because that would be, I guess, almost every country in the world at this point. We primarily look at working with developers and investors. So owners engineering, by which we mean taking a scope with a developer and really supporting them to develop that project, being part of the developer's team in lots of different ways. And we also do, as Ruben's mentioned, technical due diligence and LTA and those kind of investor-led services as well. Got more than 100 people now. We've been growing very quickly, and lots of teams around the world. We obviously, our heritage is in offshore wind, fixed and floating, but we now also look at floating solar, wave and tidal, onshore wind, onshore solar, battery storage and hydrogen. So covering kind of the key growth areas for renewables, and particularly focusing on those that are kind of in the oceans to fit with what we do as a group. So apologies for those of you who already know this, but I wasn't sure what mix we were going to have in the audience. So I'll start with what floating offshore wind is very quickly. So hopefully you're reasonably or slightly more familiar with fixed bottom offshore wind. So that's where you have an offshore wind foundation that, like a fixed oil and gas platform, kind of sits on the seabed. Floating offshore wind is what we need when we're moving into deeper water. And so that's where you have kind of a floating structure or hull that you can then put your wind turbine on top of. We have a number of different concepts out in the market, and this picture represents kind of the main subtypes. If you use the analogy of a sailing boat, the wind turbine kind of captures the wind, and the whole hull and turbine wants to kind of tilt over, and then we have to stop that somehow. And so each of these different structures does that in a slightly different way. So we've got a spar buoy, which does it much like a sailing boat does with a keel, and then a semi-submersible, which is a bit more like kind of a catamaran, so you've got a bigger area in the water to stop it tipping over. But this is really the new part of offshore wind. At the moment, there are only kind of pilot projects and pre-commercial arrays installed around the world. The biggest one being installed at the moment is Hywind Tampen in Norway, which is 88 megawatts. And so when you're comparing to kind of gigawatt scale projects in fixed bottom offshore wind, obviously the industry is a little bit further behind. So moving on to more maybe what you came for. So some of the key risks to development of floating offshore wind. I'm going to focus today on supply chain readiness and availability, but I'll run through quickly some of the other key barriers to development as well. So floating offshore wind, same as in oil and gas, the costs in deeper water are higher. So we still have a higher LCOE than we do for fixed bottom offshore wind. And that, of course, means that you need a different, the energy price is more expensive. You potentially need subsidies or some kind of mechanism from governments or off-takers to kind of allow for that higher cost of energy. They're untested technologies. Each component part of floating offshore wind, so the turbines, the concept of the hulls, the concept of the moorings, the cables, they're all tested in their own right. But what we don't have is a wind farm, commercial wind farm that's been out there for 25 years. We're using all of these technologies together. So there will be some unknown unknowns. Supply chain readiness and availability, this is what I'll go into in a bit more detail in the following slides. Serial production of foundations. Again, we're used for oil and gas for building one FPSO or one big hull for a project, not building 100. And so it's taking that single unit production experience and turning it into a production line to make 100 or more at once. Dynamic cables, we're very used to the fixed cable element of offshore wind running along the seabed, but when we've got a floating platform, we need to have a section that goes from the floating unit to the seabed, and that moves around in the water column. And as a lot of people know from the insurance industry, there have been a lot of cable failures in offshore wind anyway, so of course this is an area of focus as well. Major component exchange, so if you need to exchange a blade or a gearbox on a turbine, typically that you need a large jackup to do that, but in deeper water you can't use jackups. And so then you're looking at either using something that floats or having to take your unit back to shore to replace those major components. And so there's quite a lot of work going on in the industry at the moment, including by us in joint industry projects, to come up with a really efficient way of changing those major components if they fail over their lifetime. And finally, long-term performance. Again, we don't have a commercial scale wind farm in the water in floating offshore wind, so I'm sure there will be some things that we'll learn during the life, and we don't know exactly what the long-term performance is, but Hywind Scotland, for example, has been performing really well, better than some of its fixed bottom counterparts, so the signs are looking good so far. So why is, for the supply chain in particular, why is floating offshore wind different? Some things are the same or very, very similar. You look at your turbine, for example, those just come off the production line, the same production line as we used for fixed bottom offshore wind. Same with onshore substations, transformers, the fixed elements of the cables, those are all the same. But we have some areas that are very different. So particularly ports, we need somewhere with the ability to kind of launch these pretty large footprint foundations. And again, we're talking about, for a commercial scale wind farm, 100 or more of these at a time. We also need, ideally, deep quaysides with a high bearing capacity so we can install the turbines in the port. This is a real benefit of floating offshore wind, is that you don't necessarily need a big jackup offshore installing your turbines. Hopefully, you can do it alongside a quayside with a land-based crane. But those large land-based cranes, there's only a couple of them in the world. That most of our quaysides don't have the bearing capacity and don't have the water depth at the scale we need to do this in kind of a production line mentality. Take one unit, kind of move it along the quayside, doing different steps, for example. And we don't have enough of those quaysides available around the world. As I mentioned before, serial manufacturing of these large hulls, potentially dry dock space. Dry docks, for the most part, have been designed to fit something that's the shape of a ship. These are not the shape of a ship, and so we need some different things there, and specialist technical skills. So in fixed offshore wind, we haven't been dealing with moorings, we haven't been dealing with those flexible cables, and we can take experience from oil and gas, and we can take experience from fixed offshore wind, but we can't just directly copy everything. And I think it is a mistake that people make sometimes, thinking that because we've got floating structures in oil and gas, we can just copy and paste. And I think we've shown over the last few years that you can learn, but you can't just copy and paste. So there are a lot of opportunities in developing this new supply chain. So we've got port development. Of course, we have ports already, but all of the development activity that's needed to bring ports up to the standard or with the facilities that we need for floating offshore wind can be really beneficial for the local areas that those ports are in. So lots of investment in local infrastructure at landside as well as in the port. And as well, we've seen for fixed offshore wind, the country or the area that builds that first big port to service the industry has really had that first mover advantage. And look at Vlissingen, for example, a large volume of Europe or the North Sea's offshore wind has gone through those few big ports that were kind of the first movers in getting the facilities ready for fixed offshore wind. Job creation, so of course, any supply chain, there's always going to be jobs associated with that. And again, investment in that local infrastructure. Opportunities for export, so like everything, again, first mover, you then have the opportunity to export to the other markets that are going to be doing floating offshore wind. And manufacturing output, So heavy industrial output in the UK, in Norway, around Europe, not necessarily all around Europe, but a lot of our developed countries has dropped. And so there's an opportunity there to invest in that heavy manufacturing industry as well. So in terms of the opportunity, I know we're in Norway, but in Scotland, we had the ScotWind auction recently. And the good thing in terms of quantifying the opportunity is that in Scotland, developers had to submit a supply chain development statement, which quantified how much money they were going to spend on their projects and where they were going to spend it. So this is billions of pounds. And so these are just the floating projects as well. So there's even bigger numbers for all the fixed projects. So they were looking at spending £21.4 billion in Scotland for the ScotWind projects. 6.9 in the rest of the UK, 15.5 in the EU, and 6.2 in the rest of the world. And that's just for the floating projects. And the floating projects are where we need that development and that new supply chain. So a lot of that will also equate to investment rather than just using our existing capabilities. And that'll be replicated in everywhere that we do commercial scale floating offshore wind. It's just that for ScotWind, we happen to have the numbers publicly available because the auction system meant that we had to publish them. Of course, there are challenges. As I've mentioned, we need those deep water quaysides with high bearing capacity, lots of onshore space. If you've got 100 turbines, that's 300 blades, 100 nacelles, 100 towers. And I don't have a picture, but if you see a picture of the kind of the hinterland of a port where these are all laid out ready for installation, it's a lot of acreage that you need to build out an offshore wind project from a port. And we also need sheltered space for floating storage. So once you've got your hulls, you need somewhere to keep them. So you need some sheltered area around your port because you're not going to have room in port for all of these structures. It's going to be a real challenge to provide enough skilled labour in a short period of time. This is something that we know about around the world in the whole supply chain for offshore wind. There are not enough people. There's not enough of anything really to build out our fixed and floating offshore wind ambitions. I think we're seeing that in a lot of the energy industry. We need more energy across the board, and providing enough of everything that we need to build out all of our energy infrastructure is going to be a challenge. And then if we're talking particularly about Norway, about Europe, competing in terms of manufacturing output with lower cost economies is going to be a challenge. Of course, there's been difficulties with COVID, but China is really moving in a lot of the offshore wind space in terms of offering low price components, low price foundations, low price turbines potentially into the market. And putting sufficient investment into our facilities. So if we want to be doing all of this manufacturing, all of this development in Europe, then we need to invest in the facilities now, or they're not going to be ready in time, particularly the ports. There is a unique opportunity in Norway. There is an upcoming leasing round for fixed and floating offshore wind. So there's 2 sites that are going to be leased. I'm sure you guys know this already, so I'll do it quickly. There's the Utsira Nord site, which is going to be a floating development site. It's pretty deep water. Well, again, not by oil and gas standards, but for offshore wind, it's deep water. It's going to be a qualitative auction process. So people often refer to this as kind of a beauty contest. So developers will submit proposals for the site, and they'll be selected based on their merits rather than an auction price, like you see in the New York Bight auction recently, for example, where it was solely based on price. The fixed bottom site, the southerly one here, is going to be an auction system. So that's going to be done on price, not on a beauty contest. Norway has the advantage that they were a kind of a first mover in floating offshore wind. So with the Met Centre demo site, we had Hywind 1, the TetraSpar demo, which has just been installed, and there's going to be another 2 projects installed this year as well. And of course, there's Hywind Tampen, which is being installed at the moment. And these are really exciting. But what Norway really needs to do now with this leasing process is turn that first mover advantage into proper commercial floating offshore wind projects and fixed offshore wind projects as well. Norway has a great heritage in manufacturing. particularly kind of the Condeep and the gravity-based structures that are in the North Sea, those were really innovative at the time, and I don't think have been particularly repeated since. So this is Troll Alpha when it was ready for tow out in Norway. And so, although we're not going to be building structures quite like that for offshore wind, there's obviously still that kind of heritage of innovation, of skills, of the right mindset for getting these big projects done. Hywind Tampen, of course, is being manufactured in Norway. And there are a number of HVDC topsides that have been manufactured in Norway and taken to projects in other countries around Europe. Dole and Beta one is the example I've given here. And Prysmian and Nexans, two of the major cable suppliers for offshore wind, also have a manufacturing presence in Norway for some of their components. So there is a local supply chain that can be built on and that can be used for Norwegian projects. Just highlighted a few of the ports that have the potential to support floating offshore wind. So yeah, there's quite, as you'd expect in Norway, there's quite a lot of deep water in the fjords and deep water ports. So that's perfect for floating offshore wind. That's exactly what we need for that integration piece. There's obviously quite a number of fabrication facilities from that oil and gas heritage as well, and quite a lot of dry docks. But of course, that we need to look at the size and how these can be best used for floating offshore wind. And I think for serial production, the general feeling for floating offshore wind is that dry docks probably won't be the solution in the end, but for demo projects and smaller scale developments, they're still very useful. So Hywind Tampen, the spar buoys, so these are the long cylindrical structures that act a bit like a keel. The fabrication, they're fabricated in concrete, they were slip formed. Fabrication was started in Stord. They were towed then to, and I'm not going to try and pronounce it, this place. Someone could tell me how to say it later, I should have checked that earlier. And the slip forming was finished and then all the fit out was carried out. And so that proves exactly that it can be done in Norway. This is a pre-commercial array. This is showing electrification of oil and gas assets, which is something that we're looking at in the Gulf. We're looking at for the UK side of the North Sea. It's something that's going to be really relevant to kind of export that knowledge and that know-how to other parts of the world, and for hopefully other projects in Norway as well. And people. I think it all comes together with the people. You can have all the great facilities and the manufacturing and the auction system, but you need people to do it all. And I've discussed already, obviously the heritage and everything that we've got in Norway. And with oil and gas, this is from GWEC, from their 2022 wind report, where they did quite an in-depth analysis of which skills we can transfer from oil and gas to offshore wind. And there were some big chunks there over here where we've got saying, really good skills overlap. We can take people who've been working in oil and gas and they can move right over into offshore wind with a little bit of support to get into the industry. There's a really big chunk here where we've got some overlap. And that's where, we need to be thinking about a little bit more training, accepting that people will be a little bit less efficient for as they start working in a new industry. But, they can still move over pretty effectively. And then some other areas here where there's less overlap or less need in offshore wind for those skills, like drilling, for example. Not something we're really into in offshore wind drilling for oil and gas. But as well as taking people over from oil and gas, we also need to be looking at other industries. As I said, we need more people in energy. We need to bring people into the industry. That also means recruiting graduates and apprentices, training those young people up. If we're talking about an offshore wind pipeline that for projects now that really kind of kicks off in 2030, for projects that are in planning at the moment, like those ScotWind projects, for example, the people building those projects, they might just be starting university. So we need to make sure that those people are coming into the industry as well. And everyone in our industry needs to play a part in this. We all need to be working on inspiring the next generation and really training those young people who are so passionate about working in renewables. We've got some interns in our London office at the moment, and I was eating lunch with them the other day, and I I felt completely ostracized because I was eating meat. And they were all vegan. And so it is a generational thing, and they're all so passionate about the environment and about working in renewables and really making our world a better place. And we need to tap into that. So what next? It's really key that we need clear government commitments for project pipelines. If we're going to build ports, if we're going to build heavy manufacturing, we need a project pipeline to give investors in those facilities confidence that they're going to be used over a number of years and that they're going to get a return on their investment. We're starting to get that in a lot of markets. Norway obviously has some ambitions, but maybe not a clear pipeline on exactly when all those auctions are going to happen. So that will need to come. We need collaboration between developers and the supply chain. It's often procurement's often done on a very competitive basis. I think particularly for these floating projects in the early days, we're going to need to see a lot of collaboration between the developers and the supply chain. Because we need to make sure that the supply chain is developed in the right way. We need to make sure that there's that pipeline of projects year on year, and that developers also have the confidence that the supply chain will be there. So it goes both ways. And that, yeah, the early engagement to make sure that the investment is targeted correctly. It's no good if we build out a port to service floating offshore wind and turns out it doesn't quite meet the needs of the developers. So people like us, like OWC, we're working with developers in those early stages, using our marine heritage from ABL and those guys who've been working in marine warranty on all of the early floating projects, using those guys who've been at sea for years and years and know how all this stuff works to really bring that expertise into the early stages of projects to make sure that the projects are being developed sensibly. And then also to be able to go to the supply chain and say, you know, this is how we think, you know, we can support you, this is how you can support the developers, this is how the infrastructure can best be developed to really service the market. And I think it's also really important when you're developing these projects, to limit some of the technology and design choices to make sure that the supply chain that's available isn't excluded, especially at the moment when the supply chain isn't quite there for commercial scale floating offshore wind projects. You know, how can we make sure that there will be a local port that can service the project? How can we make sure that there will be local supply chain and somewhere to build the project? And so it's about designing the project to fit the available supply chain as well as designing the supply chain to fit the projects. And lastly, a really important point. So this is a graph of projected floating offshore wind installations, again from GWEC. Our existing pipeline of projects does not provide enough floating offshore wind to meet our net zero ambitions. If you do the kind of the top down and the bottom up of the pipeline that we've got, and the top down of what we need to support net zero, there's not enough projects in the pipeline. So even what we already think of as ambitious and really stretching the market isn't going to be enough. So there's a lot of work for us all to do. I'm quite excited about it, and I hope some of you guys are as well. So we also have recently written a report with the Catapult in the UK, looking at floating offshore wind markets around the world and doing a deep dive into which markets are going to be next for floating offshore wind or should be next for floating offshore wind. You can download that from the Catapult's website, and there's a link there, and we'll share the presentation afterwards if you want to have a look at that. But other than that, are there any questions?
Could you share some color on the competition here? Who are your main competitors on offshore wind and floating offshore wind engineering and consulting?
I think it's probably the kind of the usual suspects. People in terms of offering those owners engineering services, people like K2 who offer kind of quite similar services to those that we do in the due diligence space. Mott MacDonald, for example. I think we've been involved in a really large percentage of the early floating offshore wind projects, and we think anyway that we're kind of a real market leader in the floating offshore wind space, and having that ABL group heritage in everything that floats, it really gives us a leg up in that arena as well. Yeah, so having the OWC side expertise on the fixed offshore wind, bringing in that floating heritage from oil and gas from the maritime industry is really been powerful for us.
And do you have a view of what is the best floating turbine technology, or are you sort of agnostic when it comes to advising developers?
Well, that is a very thorny issue. I think there is technology that's right for now, and then there's technology that will be the most efficient in the long term. Obviously, we've got some clear market leaders at the moment in terms of kind of installed units and things. We've got Principal Power's WindFloat. Obviously, there's a lot of units installed, and it's a good solid technology. It works. Is it going to ultimately be the one that has the lowest LCOE? I'm not sure, but for getting units in the water, it's doing a really good job. Same with Hywind. It works. The Sparboy concept is really good for floating offshore wind, but if you don't have fjords, it's going to be really difficult to manufacture and install them. So I think there's going to be limited markets around the world where that's a really cost-effective solution. And then, of course, there's so many concepts out there. The TetraSpar that I showed, that the demo has just been installed, that has potential to be really low LCOE, but obviously the first demo has only gone in the water last year. So there's a lot to be proven still on a lot of technologies that look really promising.
Thank you.
Any other questions in the room? We don't have any questions online either.
There you go.
Guess it was all clear.
A complete run through all things floating offshore wind. I'll be hanging around for a few minutes if anyone wants to ask any questions, not to the room, and I've got some of my colleagues here as well who are also very happy to talk about floating offshore wind. Always happy to talk about offshore wind.
All right. Thanks, everyone.